Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Global History Remapping Categories and Concepts. We have a line of 6 papers today, beginning with Professor John McNeill, then Professor Joe Gouldy, and then Professor Julia McClear. And in the afternoon, we'll begin with Professor Sven Beckert, Professor Maxine Berg, and end the day with a paper from Professor Stefan Link. I'll just start off with Professor McNeill with introductions. Professor McNeill is a distinguished university professor in the Department of History in the College and the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Professor McNeill does not need an introduction, certainly not in this room, but of course I'll say a few words. He is known to us as one of the foremost environmental historians of our time, whose work in the fields of environmental history, the Anthropocene, anthropogenic climate change, and world history has been transformational. He's the author or co-author of 8 books and 18 edited books. Among them is the highly acclaimed Something New Under the Sun, an environmental history of the 20th century world, which among the numerous prizes that it won was named by Times London as one of the 10 best science books ever written. And I'll remind you, it's a history book. It was a history book, of course, and his 2010 book, Mosquito Empires, Ecology and Warfare in the Greater Caribbean, 1620-1914, won the Beveridge Prize of the American Historical Association and the Prose Award for the best book in European and world history. In 2010, Professor McNeill won the Toynbee Prize for contributions to academia and humanity. From 2011 to 2013, he was the elected president of the American Society for Environmental History. In 2014, the World History Association's Pioneer of World History Award. He's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, recipient of the Heineken Prize for History from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, Distinguished Scholar Award of the American Society for Environmental History, and the president of the American Historical Association. And he, along with his late father, William McNeill, are the only parent and child to both serve as presidents of the AHA 34 years apart. I could go on, but I suspect you'd like to hear from him and not from me. But I'll close by quoting a short segment from his AHA president's page, which says that throughout his academic life, McNeill has always conveyed his ideas in clear, accessible, often memorable, and occasionally humorous language. And he has always ventured into the darkness, searchlight in hand, helping us to see and understand the world and ourselves ever more clearly with each passing year. Professor John McNeill.
Thanks for that excess, Amitava. Only my mother would believe all that good stuff about me. I am going to try to explain what's in the paper that I prepared for this occasion and what isn't in the paper that I prepared. In this, I am venturing into what for me is unfamiliar terrain, the history of ideas and the landscape of historiography. I usually avoid such things. I'm much more comfortable in the more material realms of history. But I took what I regarded as an instruction from Daniel and Amitava to explore historiography. I took that seriously, or as seriously as I could, and found myself reading some very ancient historians and getting fascinated by things that I did not expect to get fascinated by. So the paper bears scant resemblance to what I wrote in the abstract. It is much more concerned with a quartet of very pre-modern historians, and you see them up there. And I suppose I should identify them. at the outset. From your left to your right, Herodotus, Sima Qian, Ibn Khaldun, and Baron Montesquieu. And I chose these four after examining the work of a few dozen pre-modern historians whom I hoped would have something to say about environment, and whom I regarded as world/global historians because they wrote on the geographical scale that represented a large swatch of the world known to them and to their contemporaries wherever it was that they lived. So while Sima Qian only wrote about East Asia, I'm prepared to grant him the status of world or global historian because he wrote about the world as he knew it. And the same is true for Ibn Khaldun and for Herodotus. And Montesquieu also operated in some respects as a historian of a large swatch of the globe. So that was the criterion I used to consider these as world or global historians. And some people would say Ibn Khaldun is a sociologist or Montesquieu is a political scientist. These disciplinary labels, I think, don't carry much weight in pre-modern times. And all of these characters wrote about the past and used the past to try to establish certain understandings, certain principles about the way that the world worked. So, again, perhaps too loosely, but I think, in my mind at least, justifiably, I call them all historians. There's not much argument with respect to Herodotus or Sima Qian. And I should also say, by way of introduction to these characters, not that Herodotus needs any introduction in this company, but 5th century BC Greek, Sima Qian, mainly 2nd century CE, Chinese court historian, Ibn Khaldun, 14th century North African, Montesquieu, 18th century French. Just to get a little positionality for these characters. So there's one other thing I think I ought to say by way of introduction for those of you who are not scholars of environmental history. As a self-conscious enterprise, environmental history dates to the 1970s. It arose essentially out of concerns that scholars had with environmental and ecological matters. Therefore, it is, you could say justifiably, the spawn of the larger ecology movement as it was known in the 1960s and 1970s. And it took shape first and foremost, most powerfully in the United States and among historians of the American West. But it has blossomed since then and exists wherever history exists. Whenever environmental historians contemplate the roots, the historiographical precedents of their enterprise, they mention some 19th century authors and often mention the analyst tradition and mainly the post-war analyst tradition in France, Bordel and Le Roy-Ladurie. But as I see it, environmental history has roots that can be found almost everywhere. It's like a banyan tree in this respect. And I think that's true of the subset that I'm going to speak about this morning, global environmental history. So this quartet represents what I winnowed from a larger roster of historians from centuries past who said interesting things about the environment and the relationship between the natural world and human affairs. a half dozen or so fell on the cutting room floor, and several dozen others whom I briefly examined said nothing interesting at all about environmental matters. Indeed, the ratio of interesting author to uninteresting author in my efforts was well under 1 in 10. So these 4 were the 4 who I thought met my criteria as historians, as essentially world or global historians, with something interesting to say about the relationship between society and the natural world. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of the 4 of them in a moment, but I also want to say that in the paper I also began to write about post-1970 environmental historians. And I started with Arnold Toynbee. And I discovered yesterday that Joe Gouldy and I are amongst a tiny minority of human beings who have looked at the last book that Toynbee published, which is called Mankind and Mother Earth. He, when he was 83 years old, decided that what his contemporaries then called the ecology crisis was so severe that a new conspectus of human history was required that would chronicle the relationship between humankind and planet Earth. He wrote a book that does not answer that description at all. It is a tedious military, political, religious narrative, similar to things he'd written decades previously, based on a fund of information he had gathered long ago. So he did not execute his plan, and the things that he does say about environment and ecology are absolutely routine, with no insight to them whatsoever. So it's very disappointing in that regard, but I include it because it seems to me remarkable that an 83-year-old should come to the conclusion that global environmental history was exactly what was needed in the summer of 1973. And he wrote a 641-page book in 100 days. 641-page book was haiku by Toynbee standards, but nonetheless, for the rest of us, that would be quite an achievement. He wrote between 2 and 3 million words, published between 2 and 3 million words in his life. So my pre-modern quartet, the least interesting thing that they do with the environment is discuss topography and biogeography and the weather in the context of military campaigns. Herodotus and Samachin do a lot of this. Ibn Khaldun and Montesquieu do not. The 2 interesting things that these authors do are discuss the impact of human affairs upon the environment. That is, they recognize the capacity for humans to change the natural world. This is a staple of modern environmental history. This is one of the primary exercises that environmental historians engage in, charting human impact. And all 4 of these authors do this. Samachin and Ibn Khaldun do it in the most interesting ways because they try to link anthropogenic environmental change to politics on the grand scale. Samachin tried to explain the emergence of the Chinese state that is typically considered the first empire in the history of the North China Plain, that is the Qin, in the 3rd century BCE. And he explains that largely by their water management policies, their ability to mobilize agricultural resources of lands that were previously unproductive but through the efforts of the Qin and the laborers they commanded, became agricultural surplus regions that allowed the Qin to operate a larger scale military, terrorize their neighbors, and become an imperial force. Now, there are other things that Sima Qian offers as explanation for Qin political military success, but a big one is their manipulation of the North China Plain hydrosphere and agrarian landscape. Ibn Khaldun was more fascinated by the decline of polities than by their rise, although he attended to both of these in his work. And one of the secondary or maybe even tertiary reasons that he includes for this is an environmental argument about the perils of urban living. And as background, it's important to recognize that Ibn Khaldun lived through the plague pandemic that we call the Black Death. Both his parents were killed by it. And indeed, he wrote his big book, and it's the introduction of it that includes everything that I'm talking about, the so-called Muqaddimah. He wrote his big book because he thought that the world had been so damaged, so much had been destroyed by the plague pandemic that he needed to explain to future generations how politics worked and how states rise and fall. It was the plague pandemic that was his motive in undertaking his, at least the motive he offered in undertaking his research. At any rate, he claimed that it is in the nature of things that a successful dynasty will become, over time, prosperous, urbanized, and in the process of that, the human raw material of the dynasty will become morally corrupt and physically soft. But in addition to that, the cities will be hotbeds of pollution and infection, and that this will lead to health crises and weaken the dynasty. And he wasn't entirely wrong about the health effects of urban living. At any rate, that's not his main reason. His main reason for the decline of polities is moral, which is why Arnold Toynbee thought he was a brilliant scholar. So, recognition of human impacts on the environment, and in the case of Sima Qian and Ibn Khaldun, a connection between that and large-scale political outcomes. The other interesting thing that these authors do, and they all do it, is make a case for environmental determinism and specifically climatic determinism. Sima Qian does this least of all, but he does it. He had, as an East Asian, had no exposure to the ancient Greek tradition of dividing the earth into climatic zones and attributing various human qualities to the residents of climatic zones, whereas Herodotus was familiar with this. Ibn Khaldun was familiar with it through Egyptian Greek scholarship, particularly Ptolemy, and Montesquieu was familiar with it, and they all adopted it with a few idiosyncratic wrinkles. And it's strongest in Ibn Khaldun and Montesquieu. And what they say about the impact of climate on people's physiology, moral qualities, and the societies that they're able to create is, by our standards, wacky and naively determinist. But it's interesting to me, at least, how convinced they all seem to have been of the importance of climate, especially heat versus cold. And some of the details are in the paper. I don't think there's any chronological trend here, even though, as I said a moment ago, Ibn Khaldun and Montesquieu, the 14th and 18th century authors, have a stronger commitment to climatic determinism than the earlier authors. The sample size is 4, and so I do not attribute any significance to the chronological drift there. The paper also starts in on modern environmental historians, and I note in retrospect, looking at the paper again, that there's sort of a big bang around 1988 to 1992 in global environmental history, inaugurated by a cashiered Mandarin of the Foreign Office, Clive Ponting, in a book called Green History of the World. And several other books appeared at almost the same moment, all of them in Britain. I'm not sure how to explain this, but the 1980s were a moment of high growing anxiety about climate change, a moment of either celebration or anxiety about globalization. Maybe that has something to do with a handful of authors producing global environmental histories all at once at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. That's as far as I got in the paper. It was 9,000 words, and I was asked for 5,000, so I just stopped. Plus, the summer ended, and I had to turn to other things. What I didn't do in the paper, and what I would have liked to do and may yet do, is consider some of the work produced in the last 25 or 30 years and include slice of time global environmental histories, that is, the ones that do not attempt to handle 10,000 or 300,000 year spans, but maybe just the early modern centuries, as John Richards did, or just the 20th century, as I did. Also, thematic global environmental histories that don't try to handle the entirety of the relationship between society and the natural world, but instead some subset thereof, whether that subset is soil or nitrogen or environmentalism or warfare or the profit motive or forests or the Anthropocene, to mention a few examples of thematic approaches that exist. So I hope to do that. And then I want to explore a critique of extant global environmental history that was first produced by Swedish anthropologist Alf Hornborg, a world systems devotee, who drew a distinction between global environmental history that operates by accretion and global environmental history that emphasizes relationship. He prefers the latter, and he wants world systems theory to inform that approach to relational global environmental history. He considers me one of the sinners, and that despite the fact that we're friends and we've co-edited books together. But and I think in some respects he's right that the book I wrote about the 20th century does underplay relational aspects, the ways in which activities in one part of the world affect ecology in another part of the world. And I have a book in view which will attend to that theme for the 19th century. But I have to clear my desk before I'm going to write that. So I want to explore that critique, which I think has some merit to it, despite the fact that I'm one of the targets of it. And then the last thing I want to do is explore the role for global environmental history of new kinds of data, especially paleoclimate data, that are coming out thanks to the work of a handful of scientists, and to a lesser extent, other paleoscience data, ancient DNA, which has some, but not strong, relevance so far to global environmental history. So those are the things as yet undone in this project, and I'm sure I'm way over time by now. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Professor McNeill. I'll open the floor to questions. Joe.
Thanks so much for that lucid paper, John. I want to ask you about where you start the story. So Toynbee is a node. We can start the environment. We can say there's no modern environmental history before 1968 and when the ice cores were drilled, because there's new knowledge of climate and atmospheric harm that becomes available at that point. And so the writing of the 1980s and 1990s responds to that. But in my training in a department of architecture before I came to history, we spent a lot of time reading a much longer historiography of relationships between man and the environment, between Montesquieu in the 1980s. And among the sources that I would have expected to see in a review of this kind would be Clarence Glacken's Traces on the Rhodian Shore, which is a monument. It was the first volume of an intended 2-volume masterwork on the history of attitudes towards the environment since ancient Greece. The second half of that project was famously thrown into the fire in a fit of despair when he reached midlife and decided that it would not live up to the standard of perfection he required. But we have the first volume. And then there's another series of volumes that I would say stretch back. I would set the chronology with something like Lewis Mumford's Story of Utopias, which is a 1920s volume, which starts off with him staring at the landscape in Sweden and trying to imagine removing industrialization, removing urbanization, going back in time, and the changing iterations of social relationships with landscape, and then going in search of cultural and social materials that comment on that, for which he goes into, basically a history of science fiction narratives about what the city is and what the city could be. So I wonder about what the stakes are of understanding a longer strain of thought about our relationships with the environment that took conservation very seriously, but was not yet aware of climate change. I find in that tradition a very powerful set of sources for thinking about the necessity of governing a shared resource, which are still applicable in the era after Mauna Loa. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So I think, if I remember correctly, in the paper there's sort of a note either to myself or to the reader that says all the authors between Montesquieu and Toynbee need to be put in here. And I should have said that in my presentation. So I'm not going to ignore that entirely, but I'm not going to explore it in depth. And the reason for that is every effort at navel gazing, historiographical navel gazing by environmental historians does talk about these guys. And so I will bow in that direction. I agree, Glacken is an incredible work. Whether it qualifies as global or not depends on how much you believe in the second volume. But you're right, those are parts of the banyan tree's roots, and I do not intend to neglect them entirely, even though I did so this morning. Sorry about that.
We'll go to Julia next.
Thank you very much for this really wonderful paper. We talked a lot yesterday about myth and history, and I know you're already taking on an awful lot of histories of the climate and so on, but I wondered whether you'd consider branching out to theology and integrating texts like Gilgamesh or even the Bible, because these are kind of all about human anxiety about the kind of destructive force of nature, but also possibilities for sort of overcoming it and what comes next. So is theology part of this historiography?
Julia, that is a terrible idea. It's more than enough for me to wrestle with a quartet of pre-modern historians. I'm very consciously trying to limit my scope to those for whom I can make a case that they qualify as historians. The author of the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells a story. Bible has lots of stories. I'm not prepared to call those the works of historians, both on definitional grounds, but also because I don't want to go there.
Other questions?
Are they calls to action? So it's a really interesting thing for me reading Ibn Khaldun, is the notion of a kind of commentary on decline in terms of management of urban structures, the winnowing away of civilizations where people will go soft, right? Do they all write to the future in that way, giving lessons, warning us and warning their readers about what could happen to them?
So I think that the majority of modern authors writing global environmental history include a dollop of variable size of warning and attempt at offering guidance to how to achieve a better future. The pre-modern quartet, none of them do that, as far as I can tell. They were, first of all, even though Ibn Khaldun and Montesquieu were deep climatic determinists, they did not consider environmental matters the first and foremost concern that they had as historians, and they did not see that the environment was itself in any kind of crisis. It had significance, but it was not in crisis. The modern ones, generally, there are probably some exceptions to that, are really worried about the state of the global environment, whether it's climate change or a broader agenda of concerns. And so they all, maybe I should say we all, do dabble in warning and prophecy. With various degrees of stridency. I tend to be amongst the more sedate. Some of my readers and friends are irritated by that. But short answer, yes, lots of it in the moderns.
Sven.
That was great. Just a quick question. From what we now know, is it even possible to write a non-global environmental history any longer?
A non-global? I'm tempted to say yes, but I'm going to say no. because I think it depends on the kind of environmental history that one undertakes. And if it is about the regulation of asbestos and the health of construction workers in Northwest Kingston, Ontario, in the 1950s, I think that can be a sub-global history, although one would probably want to go to the asbestos mines in Quebec in that study. I think it is possible to write sub-global environmental histories of certain subjects, but I think it's also at least ill-advised, if not impossible, to write sub-global environmental histories of other kinds of subjects, just because of the extreme ecological connectivity, particularly of the last 2 centuries.
Daniel.
So one of the questions that has come up periodically in the last couple of days is the issue of scale. And, you know, I recall Heather's comment that the world is not a place, the globe is not a place. It's essentially an attitude when you were writing history. So speaking from the perspective of a historian of historiography rather than an environmental historian or a pure global historian, I would pick up on Sven's comment just now and think that while your quartet absolutely great names, and in terms of considering a wider patch of terrain than their own, of course, the world for Sima Qian was, you know, Zhongkou, the Chinese world, the East Asian world. For Herodotus, it was the Mediterranean. But there is, I think, a strong tradition of much more local environmental history and again, it also depends how you were defining environment. But I think this goes back, I think, a bit to Joe's comment, things like the built terrain and land patterns and so forth. Those are prominent in a number of medieval works and early modern works that probably would not reach the same level of augustness as the Fab Four up there. But I think particularly going to my home area of early modern England, of the number of antiquaries who were writing topographies of early modern England and very much commenting on changes in the environment and so forth. They weren't commenting obviously on it with sort of modern ideas, and in fact they had very little idea of, certainly not progress, but also of change. But things like even Sir Thomas More commenting on the overpopulation of sheep in England, occasioning enclosures and so forth. So I think, well, if we take the globe as the criterion, then yeah, we probably are much more limited in terms of the prehistory, just because of the limitations on what people actually thought of as their world or its size. But if we're taking global as covering various aspects of the planet, but not necessarily the whole planet, then I think we're in a very, very different set of definitions, and you have a much deeper prehistory. So just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, my thought is I don't want to go there either. I have a limited amount of time and energy, and so I am consciously trying to draw boundaries around this, lest I spend the rest of my earthly days on this one project. I'll also say that with respect to these early modern English authors whom you mentioned, of whom I've probably read very, very few, if they had been writing about the overpopulation of sheep in England, in Tibet, and in, not that there were many sheep there at the time, but in Patagonia, I would say that's a kind of global history. But if they're only writing about England, it doesn't meet my criteria. So what I'm saying is you don't have to cover every square inch of the planet to be global or world historian, but you have to do more than one patch. I think Maxine knows more about this than I do, but there's sort of a global microhistory rising trend, little places, but seen in bigger contexts, either comparative or connective. That qualifies to me, but Sir Thomas More does not qualify for me.
Just a very
And even if he did, I'm not going there. I've got too much on my plate as it is.
well, something for somebody else to do, perhaps. But just a quick follow up that I seem to be particularly fixated by sheep these days. But I will say, and I see my colleague Emily Hill has her hand up. One of the other things I'd be interested to have her comment on this is the Chinese gazetteers of the Ming and earlier Fangxi, I think is the Chinese word. So maybe I don't know if Emily's next on the list.
Thanks, Daniel. No doubt we are all fixated with sheep these days. We know why, but we'll go to Julia.
Sorry, I'm still making a plea for Thomas More's Utopia because it's based on the anxiety triggered by the discovery of the New World and what this kind of opens up, and so I think it is kind of a dawning of a new type of global environmental knowledge. But theology is discounted. Maybe Thomas More can stay in.
I'll take that under advisement.
Before I go to Andrew, those of you who are online, if you could post your questions in the chat. Andrew.
Andrew Janschel, Department of History. I have a definitional question, which is, why is climatic determinism environmental history? So in the case of Montesquieu, I mean, he says climates determine these features. He freezes a sheep's tongue and cuts it open to prove his theory that the people of the North are hardier than those of the South. And he's, criticized widely at the time for his climatic determinism. But why is this environmental history?
Well, because Montesquieu uses that to explain some of the what he regards as durable social characteristics of various parts of the world. For example, he has an argument about slavery and autocracy and how that derives from climatic considerations, what distinguishes Europe from Asia over the centuries. To me, that is a historical argument rooted in a conception of the role of climate on human physiology.
Emily, did you see your question?
So, John, your stance on what you are working on reminds me of something that the famous teacher Confucius said. He said to students, "I don't talk about spirits. Don't ask me about spirits." So I'm wondering if you could use a term, a sphere term, in your wonderful book, Something New Under the Sun. You have an organizing principle of dividing the world into these slices, the hydrosphere, pedosphere, several others. So I'm thinking it might be helpful to attach a similar label to what you are discussing and leave all the other spheres out. So it's a group of literate people in ages when there were a few of them, imagining the whole world what they could do to imagine the whole world. And is that a kind of, it's an imagined world, right, in each case, but they had their empirical evidence, the sheep's tongue and so on, to base it on. So maybe more what they felt was good evidence than the Epic of Gilgamesh or Utopia by More. So I'm just giving some suggestions. Thank you, teacher.
So
Confucius.
yes, I've been likened to many things and people before, but never to Confucius. I'm not sure how I feel about that. So you're suggesting that I ought to group this inquiry in such a way that it is yet another sphere, a sphere of imagined world environments. I mean, there is the so-called noosphere, that's the universe of ideas, according to Teilhard de Chardin. But this is a subset of the noosphere. It's ideas about a certain range of things. I'll take that under advisement too. But I don't know. To me, this betrays my inexperience in history of ideas and historiography. To me, that's a murky kind of a sphere, whereas the hydrosphere, the pedosphere, the atmosphere, they seem a bit more solid.
I think I'll ask a couple of questions. The first is a question of curiosity. What sort of things are we learning from ancient DNA that would otherwise be unknown? And the second I ask with considerable trepidation is, do you make a distinction between global and planetary? Is that helpful from your vantage, and how would you comment on that distinction?
With respect to the second question, no, I have yet to adopt Dipesh Chakrabarty's distinction there. I don't find it objectionable, but I haven't followed in those footsteps, at least not yet. With respect to ancient DNA, it tells us things that we did not know before, although without great certainty, that are relevant to global environmental history in probably three main arenas. One of those is migration. And the geneticists have spent a lot of time trying to, as they might put it, document histories of large-scale migration, folk migrations. And so far, a lot of that is confirmation of what archaeologists have already told us, but I think there are at least a few new wrinkles. Second arena would be diet. Ancient DNA can tell you a little bit about what people were eating, and that is relevant to environmental history. It can help us figure out when maize cultivation reached a particular Caribbean island. And the third arena is disease. Ancient DNA studies are beginning to shed light on a handful of human pathogens and their history, their geography. I expect there will be more. Ancient DNA study is in its infancy. There's a lot of problems with placing too much faith in the data, and especially in the interpretations placed upon the data by geneticists who are normally unrestrained in their enthusiasm for the significance of their findings and minimally educated in history and archaeology or historical linguistics, all of which are relevant to the claims that they typically make. So, caveat lector.
Thank you, Edward.
Hi, my name is Edward Tchaikovsky. I'm a PhD student here, Dr. Woolf's student. As I'm sure you're aware, there are many historians who would object to using the term global to really any period prior to the modern period on the basis that people back then didn't really have the same conception of the global that we do. Their conception of the known world would be different from our conception of the global. What would you say to that?
I'm going to go back to yesterday's discussion of distinctions or no distinctions between world history and global history. And I'm in the camp that doesn't want to distinguish between those two terms. And I'm also perfectly content to use world as an adjective or global as an adjective for things that happened in the past. I think the Little Ice Age was a global phenomenon, although expressed differently in different locations. And the fact that people in the 13th, 14th, 15th century had a much narrower geographic awareness than we have in the 21st century doesn't, in my mind, make that event any less global or make the word global any less applicable to the Little Ice Age. So I think I'm going to keep using it regardless of objections.
Paige.
Hi, I'm Paige. I'm a first-year PhD student with Amitava. And when you were talking earlier about modern environmental historians often having warnings, or I find perhaps lessons in their works, and often coming from a place of concern for the climate crisis or environmental or ecological destruction, I would say, budding environmental historian, like to think that our work has value in the current global climate crisis. But I also wonder where the limitations are, and I'm just curious to know what you think about that. Where are the strengths in environmental history for having a role to play in the climate crisis, and where are its limitations?
So that's a big issue throughout the whole subfield of environmental history, whether it is done on this scale or that scale. And every environmental historian thinks about the degree to which their work is going to be socially useful. And some of them regard this as the main reason for doing what they do. Others do not. So there's a million different places one can situate oneself on the spectrum between being a historian whose main function is advocacy and being a historian who's trying to avoid being understood as engaging in advocacy. And there are wrinkles in this, at least as I see it. Overt advocacy is in recent decades so routine as to be, in my view, less effective as a way of communicating concern. And I'm pretty anxious about destabilization of climate and other aspects of global ecological disruption. But I try personally not to sound the alarm bell overtly. I try to make the case calmly and sort of stealth alarmist. And that's a conscious decision that I make. At the other end of the spectrum, there are great examples. And my favorite one, it's not really global environmental history, it's about the Atlantic coast forest in Brazil, the Mata Atlântica, by Warren Dean, a book called With Broad Axe and Firebrand, published in the 1990s. Warren Dean wore his heart on his sleeve in that book. But he does it beautifully, and he does it with full responsibility to the craft of the historian. That is, amassing evidence, sifting it, critically analyzing it. He has not abandoned the craft of the historian. And some environmental historians do sometimes abandon that in order to achieve what they regard as higher goals.
Maybe just one last question, Kastrinia, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a little tiny question to finish it off, which is, what is historiography? I think a lot of the questions around what gets included and what doesn't, in terms of like who counts as a historian and who can be cases that can be included in the study, is kind of related to how you define historiography itself. Because in this case, it's not so much what is the field of like global environmental historian, what does a global environmental historian read for their oral fields exam, is probably not, the Fab Four. So then it's sort of, it seems to me like this is who are people who have in the past thought about both the world in a large scale and the environment in a large scale, and have thought of themselves, or maybe have written about the past, because how we define historians is also a little ambiguous. So then maybe not the Bible, but what about like religious thinkers, like, I don't know, maybe Aquinas or something, who are also writing about the past and maybe the world and maybe environment. I guess it all rests on how you define how this is historiography, which I would love to know.
So if I heard you correctly, you said you had a tiny question, which is, what is historiography? I wish to correct you on that. What is historiography is not a tiny question. Smarter people than I spend their entire lives wrestling with that, as you well know. So I have to admit that the boundaries I have installed around this project are arbitrary in many respects, and one can object that Montesquieu is not historian enough. One can't, although I would fight against that, and one could argue that various theologians and religious thinkers are historian enough, and that I should admit them to the inner circle. But I'm trying, as I said before, to confine my gaze to those who, one, write about the past and use the past as a way to try to derive insight about human affairs generally, and two, authors who, on some level, are global or world or cosmopolitan or ecumenical in their choice of subject matter. And as I said before, that what qualifies under that criterion depends on when and where they lived. And the standard is higher today than it is 2,000 years ago. But it is arbitrary where I choose to draw the lines, and I can't deny that. I don't see how to avoid it. But as you can tell from the discussion of the last half hour, or maybe more, beginning with Julia's terrible suggestion, I am desperate not to expand my horizons here. It's unwieldy and long enough as it is.
Thank you, John. I think that brings us to a close to this paper.